Most important. Okay, so now it's recorded. Thank you for the warm introduction, Coco. We appreciate it. I'm honored to be among you all to just for a few minutes to chat about some of the work that we do with the communities responding to extreme weather. And I'm grateful that you've taken some time out of your day. I understand that some have to be here because there's classes for credit, and then for others, just perhaps have a interest in the environmental stuff that's happening. So again, we thank you for being here, whether it's for credit or not. I'm so glad to be here with you. So we're going to get started. Can everyone, by show of hands or thumbs up, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen, maybe a nod of a head, yes? All right, that's wonderful, that's wonderful. All right, appreciate it. All right, so we'll go into this here. Climate impacts in Greater Boston. All right, we're gonna delve deep, y'all. And let's start. So, the Better Future Project, CREW is part of the Better Future Project. And the Better Future Project works to build a powerful grassroots movement to address the climate crisis and advance a rapid and responsible transition beyond coal, oil, and gas towards a renewable energy future for us all. So there are three programs. There is 350 Match, which some of you here today may or may not have heard of. There is Divest Ed, which again, some that are joining us today may or may not have heard of. And then this could be CREW. Communities responding to extreme weather. The fundamental difference between these programs is that 350 Mass and Divest Ed are more on advocacy work and pushing for institutions to do a certain thing or governments to do a certain thing. For example, 350 Mass is a strong proponent of the Green New Deal. So it's just one of the driving public policies that 350 Mass is pushing and advocating for. And Divest Education is a program that works with the students across the country to a staff working with students to encourage their institutions and universities to divest pensions from fossil fuels companies. And then we have CREW, which we're here to talk about more in depth on today. So we have CREW. CREW is, again, we have already named what it is, and I just want to parenthetically say this. If you have any questions, please feel free to quote it, put it in the chat, or you can save it to the end, or you can interject. But if you plan on interjecting, please just put it in the chat that you would like to interject so we can prepare accordingly. Is that all right? That's all right. All right. Y'all a good crowd today. All right. I was in church. I asked somebody to say amen, but everybody on mute, so that's all right. It's maybe you can just put your hands up if you hear something. That's all right. If you hear something that resonates, but that's quite all right. So CREW is a young grassroots organization that aims to build equitable, inclusive, and I might add sustainable neighborhood climate resilience in New England through hands-on education, service, and planning. So CREW is essentially interested in preparing people for extreme weather that comes as a result of climate change. So to be more specific, what we're talking about, sisters and brothers, so what we're talking about is we're talking about heat waves, we're talking about floods, we're talking about stormwater runoff, we're talking about severe winters, or more intense winters, and these are some of the manifest impacts of what climate change has caused or will cause here in New England. So essentially, we are a grassroots program. CREW is the youngest program of the Better Future Project. CREW has been around for almost 2 years now. I've had the blessed privilege to be the program manager for almost about a year now. Next month will be a year. Time flies. Time certainly does rapidly fly. So that is the difference, and we're statewide. We have a focus statewide. We believe that all of New England is going to be impacted. All of Massachusetts is going to be impacted, and ultimately all of New England is going to be impacted. Ultimately, the whole world will be impacted by climate impact. So, what are the impacts of climate change we can expect to see here in New England? Don't all answer at once. Just think about that for a second. Let that resonate. We talked about a few already. So let's start with this. Let's start with heat. So this chart that you all can see, I want to point out a few things. So on the left, where it says 1971 to 2000, we see that in the orange is the low temperature above 90 degrees. On the low side, 90 degrees, low scenario. But the low scenario and high scenario really plays in between 2055 and 2084. But for the 1971 to 2000, this is what happened. So we saw that there were 10 days of 90-degree temperature or above. And there was one day of 100-degree temperature between 1971 and 2000. Between 2015 to 2044, which is the time frame we're currently in, it is expected that we will have 29 days of 90-degree temperature and 2 days of 100-degree temperature. And we see here that in 2055 to 2084, we are expected to see over 60 days of weather over 90 degrees and many different scenarios. So what we understand is when we juxtapose this, and I want to mention, summer here is for 91 days here in New England. Summer is considered to be 91 days of June through August. So this is for essentially a 3-month period. And the direction that we're heading is over 60 of those 91 days will be temperature over 90 degrees. So the reason that this is disastrous, sisters and brothers, the reason that this is disastrous is because when there's extreme weather, there are certain segments of the human population that are very vulnerable to extreme weather and can likely experience fatalities, can likely to experience severe complications. Let's go through some of those categories. So we have low-income communities, we have the elder population, we have people of color communities, right, which are predominantly cities, right? So particularly, the problem is exacerbated if there's an urban heat island effect. If there is a neighborhood, which is mostly a lot of cities, big cities, metropolitan cities in America, where you have a community and there is a lot of concrete, but there's not a lot of trees. So oftentimes that's referred to as the urban heat island effect, which therefore, if there's all concrete in a community, it increases the temperature and can make the temperature feel 4 to 10 degrees hotter than what it actually is. So let's go through this a little bit. We saw, and someone on the call may not recall this, but maybe some have read about this or maybe some have lived through this. In 1995, there was a heat wave, the disastrous heat wave in 1995 in Chicago. And unfortunately, 739 people died in Chicago because of this disastrous heat wave. But I really want to lift up this work that has been done by a sociologist named Eric Klingenberger. At the time, he was a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley campus, and he was compelled to go and to study the effects of the heat wave. He was compelled to go and to see sociologically how the heat waves impacted the communities in Chicago. So what happened? So really, what happened is he went and he did his dissertation and his research on Chicago, and he went block by block, step by step, block by block rather, and he looked and he found his evidence suggested that the greatest indicator of survivability in heat waves is not the color of your skin, not where you live, not where you drive, how much money you got in the bank. That's not necessarily relevant to survivability. The greatest indication of survivability, Klingenberger said, was your social network, and that's really what we do at Crew. We look to help these communities become climate resilient through social resiliency. So essentially, Klingenberger produced a book. If anyone's interested, it should check it out. It came out in 2000. The social autopsy of the 1995 Chicago heat wave, and he really recaps his research. And the thing I want to lift up out of that for this particular conversation that's relevant for the purposes of our discussion is he said that, boom, 739 deaths could have easily been 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 or more if it were not for the fact that people, neighbors, were checking in on neighbors to do a wellness check. Because think about it, I'm from Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, born and raised. That's where I spent most of my young days, kind of like Will Smith, First Prince of Bel-Air. Maybe if that predated some of y'all should go check that out. But and it's universal in Philadelphia that. And on every block, there is an older person. There's an older person who may be an empty nester and lives by him or herself or their self, but yet and still is still knows a lot of things that's happening on the block. If you want to know some news, the lady on my block was Miss Agnes. If you wanted to know the news about who did what with who and what's going on, you go to Miss Agnes. But people like Miss Agnes, Miss Agnes was in her 70s. So people like Miss Agnes is vulnerable to heat waves because she lives by herself. She was an empty nester, and she, in our community, we didn't have a lot of trees. So we also had, the problem of the heat waves was compounded by, the urban heat island effect. But for people like Miss Agnes, and I'm sure there are tons of Miss Agneses in the world, or people like Miss Agnes in Chicago and in other cities in this country and across the world, who are very vulnerable. And the way that they can survive this type of extreme weather of heat is be connected, to have social resiliency, be socially connected to their neighbors. So if they needed some help, and there's someone that's consciously checking in on them, that person can provide that help. So let's go to the next extreme. Let's now go to the next extreme weather. So let's go to rain and snow. So, we are predicted to receive an increase in the amount of rain and snow and precipitation because of the climate change, because of the damage that's already been done because of climate change. The top 1% of storms and snow over the last, I think, 20 or 30 years have seen in New England 55% greater intensity, 55% and more precipitation. And we believe that that's related to climate change. And obviously that comes from, this image is provided by the National Climate Assessment in 2014. So what we have, New England, Boston, Cambridge is a coastal city. And really simply what that means, and I know I got some tough educated folks on the line, so I know I'm talking to some area dishes and some area dishes people, but really where the rubber meets the road here, what we see is storm. So when storms are happening, you have stormwater runoff. 1 + 1 is 2, right? So when the storms happen, then you have what's called stormwater runoff. And I want to lift up this map right here. Do you see this is Kindle MIT? So that's a T-stop for some of those who don't know. And all this purple, it represents stormwater runoff. And you can see that by 2070, that you see Central Square in the top left corner. This community will have a massive amount of flooding because of stormwater runoff, which is another climate impact. So then we have coastal flooding. So I want to lift this up. This is Boston. I want you to look at this map real quickly. You see the areas of blue. This is by 2030. You see the areas of blue. You see Charlestown, Back Bay. You see Boston Commons. And again, this is a projection, but it's likely to happen. And then you see Logan Airport on the right side. But look at this, y'all. By 2050, you see there's more blue. Even Stevie Wonder can see that. You can see that there's more blue, and we see that this blue represents flooding. This blue represents areas that will be underwater. Because a lot of Boston is at landfill. So we can see that between 2030 and 2050, there's a difference. But watch this, y'all. In 2070, oh my God, OMG! You see this? This is just ridiculous here. This is ridiculous because we understand that this water, that this is more blue and a lot more blue. So certain communities in Boston will be underwater, unfortunately. Back Bay, South Boston, parts of Dorchester, et cetera, according to the projection. So what this is known as, obviously, as sea level rise, coastal flooding and sea level rise. So we understand that it's going to get more and more intense. And then we see hurricane surges here. Now, obviously, we don't see too many hurricanes in this part of the country, but I want to lift up something. I want to lift up that Hurricane Superstorm Sandy. If it would have hit Boston 4 hours earlier, we would have had a lot more damage than what we received. Obviously, New York and New Jersey received a lot of damage, but we would have received a lot more if it was high tide and 4 hours earlier. So I want to talk about a little bit about the Bahamas and the storm Duran. So we understand that when storms happen, disruption happens. So I'm going to read this, what happened last year. Hurricane Duran is the strongest hurricane on record to have hit the Bahamas, and one of the strongest Atlantic hurricanes on record. Hurricane Duran killed at least 70 people in the Bahamas, caused extensive flooding and damage to homes and infrastructures on the Northwest Islands, Abaco and the Grand Bahama, as well as widespread power outages. And this is really what the damages of what hurricanes do. And those are some links there. We don't have to go through that. But there's also some social and psychological impacts here, and I'm keeping an eye on time. And I want to talk about some of the sociological effects, but check out this picture. This is a person whose life has been disrupted by extreme weather. Let's talk about Hurricane Katrina. So and this is from the American Psychological Association. That's the source of this information. Hurricane Katrina, we'll use that as a case study. And that was in New Orleans in 2005. Up to 55% of the adults and 45% of children suffered depression after a natural disaster. 49% of Hurricane Katrina survivors develop an anxiety or mood disorder. 1 in 6 develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Suicide and suicidal ideation more than doubled. Outside of the United States, the suicide of 60,000 Indian farmers over the past 30 years or 3 decades have been directly linked to climate change. An increase of 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit on any given day was linked to 335 deaths. So I want to talk a little bit about the crumbling community effect here. And I'm going to read from the slide. Indirect impacts. So we talked about some of the direct impacts, heat waves. We talked about coastal flooding, stormwater runoff, sea level rise. We talked, those are some direct impacts. So let's talk a little bit about indirect impact. So climate change can affect the way we think about ourselves, each other, and the world. After a climate event resulting in displacement, people may experience a diminished sense of self, difficulty relating to others, diminished social interactions, nostalgia, the loss of sense of place, solace, and security tied to one's physical environment. Community impacts include domestic abuse, child abuse, and violence, assault, for example, assault and civil conflict. Economical insecurity and physical damage are other potential effects. But let's talk about cooperation here. Cooperation establishes social ties and connections with community members. This will help withstand the changes and encourage adaptation. So what does Crew do about all this? I'm going to talk for about 5-10 more minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for question and answers. So before we go into all that, I want to just delineate. Just real quickly that I look at the climate justice movement in 3 different ways. I look at it in 3 different lanes. I look at the advocacy portion, which we mentioned earlier, groups like 350 Mass, Divest Ed, other organizations such as Sunrise, Sierra Club, which I'm executive board member of the Sierra Club here in Massachusetts, newly appointed. Woohoo! Groups like that are those who advocate for bold changes, such as they're more advocacy groups. They're whether it's pushing for the Green New Deal, plastic bans, etc. Then you have the second lane. You have which I would call climate resiliency lanes. So we call the first lane climate advocacy, second lane climate resiliency, and then the third lane is the restoration movement lane. But in the climate resiliency, you have adaptation and mitigation. So you have the 2 lanes split under climate resiliency. So Crew operates in the lane of climate adaptation because we're trying to help prepare people to adapt to this extreme weather. Now, I want to show you how we do it, but and then it's the groups who are promoting, who are focusing on restoration of ecosystems, like organizations such as Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. Their organization that I'll call operates within the third lane of the climate justice movement, and that's strictly focused on restorations of ecosystems and promoting and focusing on biodiversity. So let's come back to the second lane, adaptation, and this is what we do. And then this is the work that Crew does. So we have community teams. So remember, I mentioned a little earlier, that we have that social resiliency piece. And what we do is we look to establish Crew teams across the state. We have one, Somerville, Cambridge. We're looking to get some started. Ideally, we like them started in every community. But it's going to take a little time, and obviously with the COVID-19 that has shifted operation just a small tiny bit in terms of we can't meet people in person, but we use the mediums that we have in order to connect with folks. So essentially, community teams are teams of volunteers in a given community that come together. And and come together around how can we strengthen social solidarity within our community? How can we build social solidarity within our community? How can we connect with our neighbors? So for an example, our team in Somerville had last year had a climate social. And the way they advertised it was they connected with organizations who already have a base within the Somerville community, and they sent information to send it to their base, and for folks to come out. So they have monthly meetings. So our crew teams have monthly meetings and discuss, ways to outreach to other organizations in the community, other people in the community, et cetera. So the goal is that the local communities on the grassroots level, that the local community, that these crew teams would operate on the grassroots level, and they would focus specifically on their community, because how flooding impacts Back Bay is different than how flooding impacts Brighton, Austin, which is communities in Boston. And they're higher, they're so like Brighton, Austin is not in danger of being flooded, where Back Bay is in danger of being flooded because it's, over landfill. So we know that different communities have different challenges, and it gets really interesting when you start talking about cities that these communities are in. So our goal is one of our practical goals is to build these crew teams with the leading idea that connecting with neighbors and being connected with folks drives the work. And what some crew team do is, you see somebody with a sledgehammer here on the right. What crew teams do is we have what's called depaving events. So these are people here. Depaving, right? Depaving is simply breaking up concrete. So we have some people from our Somerville team who specialize in depaving. Depaving has been happening in the Somerville community for 10 years, but somehow, some way, this predated before I got the crew. Crew was able to connect with folks in Somerville, and some of those folks were on the depaving team. So we do depaving, mostly driveways and people's private property, because we don't think it's prudent nor wise to just go and break up concrete in public places. And the purpose of breaking up concrete, obviously, is if you break up the concrete, you can help create more green space. But obviously, with private properties, people have the ability to do what they like. But that's the purpose of destroying concrete, is so that more carbon can be pulled out of the air and it's more cooler when you have more green space. So that's what that depaving event is all about. Then we have resiliency hubs. Resiliency hub, we actually have about 15 of these across the state. So we have someone on the staff who is a resiliency hub coordinator. And what he does is we work with organizations that have a physical space, so we have libraries, we have faith communities that are part of these resiliency hubs, and essentially they can serve as a cooling center in the wintertime, a cooling center in the summertime, warming center in the wintertime. And they also commit to doing a workshop once a year around climate resiliency, but there's a lot of other functions that a resiliency hub can serve as. But that's another practical way in which we try to engage organizations in a given community. And we also we help people make emergency preparedness kits, which we'll get to in just a second. But so there's a display emergency. There will be, after this corona situation slows down, there will be emergency preparedness kits at these resiliency hubs. So we already have them at our office. Our office is in Cambridge, but we can't ship them out because things have been disrupted by the coronavirus. So those are what resiliency hubs are, and it really we like our resiliency hubs to, it's a number of functions that they can meet, and they're not required to meet all the functions. The main function that all the resiliency hubs we like them to commit to is at least once a year holding a workshop around climate resiliency so that the local community members can be educated about climate resilience. And also, we're hoping that our resiliency hubs will allow our crew teams or in the community, or when a crew team gets established in that community, to also meet there. So this is a little bit of what it takes to be a resiliency hub. This is just some of the functions, like display a climate resiliency hub window decal that we provide. We talked about making emergency preparedness, making climate emergency preparedness information. We give like PDFs out that they make them. They should make those available to their patrons. So we give like PDFs of preparedness, like what identifying signs of heat stroke, identifying signs of frostbite, etc. And we have that on display, or we will have that on display after we get through this current situation, this pandemic that we're in. And last year, we have a climate prep week, and we have it this year too. We have it every year. It's normally September 24th to September 30th. And last year, we actually had about 134 events. We had 128 in Massachusetts, actually, and we had 6 nationally. And so we will certainly, we do have some information on our website, climatecrew.org, about this year's Climate Prep Week. So if anyone's interested in hosting their own event, last year there were events from the first year that the Climate Prep Week happened in 2018. There were 35 events, and in 2019 it was 134. And again, 128 in the state and 6 nationally. And the events can range from a documentary, a book discussion, panel discussion, etc. In fact, we have someone on the call who was involved last year. We have, if he's still here, Nick Rabb. Yeah, he's on the call. He's a tough student. He participated in a couple of our events. We're so glad to have him participate. But so that's also what we have. And then we're coming to a close here. We have, let me see here. They're making a plan. This is a preparedness kit. We actually have a book bag that has some of these items in it. And then once we do workshops like similar to this, or we do these workshops, we pull out stuff in the bag. So this is some of the stuff in the bag here. But the bag is customized and can be customized to a person's specific situation. But the disaster kit is made with the idea in mind that, maybe the rescue squad won't get to you in a while, but you want something that'll help you survive for a couple hours, couple of days until help comes. All right, so we're going to put a pin right here at this juncture. I think I'm done with the presentation. I think we can open it up for Q&A. So we're at about 12:39, 1 minute before 12:40, and let's open it up. And I can turn it back over to Sarah or.
Thank you, Vernon. So let's see, I'm new to this as well, but I think the best way to go about this is just, if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself, and otherwise you are muted by default, so it's not everybody talking at the same time. So does anybody have a question?
Look like Colin raised right there.
Go ahead, Colin.
Oh, we can't hear you. You're on mute. And you look like in the jungle too. You look like in the jungle.
I'm preparing for warmer climates. I thank you so much for presenting. I'm really interested in this climate preparedness week, and I feel like having it in September was very strategic because of it being hurricane season. And I was wondering if that is the history of that chosen time. I feel like it's a good time to focus on climate as opposed to Earth Day. I think it's harder to get traction in April to focus on climate. I'm wondering if you've found particular times of year where getting community traction and gatherings have been better than others?
Oh, thank you so much for that, Colin. So the reason that Climate Prep Week is in September is because September, many people don't know this, is National Preparedness Month. So we line it up with national. I mean, now obviously the date was chosen before I ever arrived at Crew, but it's because it's Climate Preparedness Month. The idea was that this falls in line. So I'm not too clear on why April wasn't chosen, but obviously there's a lot of events that happen around Earth Day in April. But so that's why, from what I've been informed, why Climate Prep Week is in September, because it's National Preparedness Month.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that was a good idea. So if you want to ask a question, you could try to raise your hand on the participant box, and you do that. How do you do that?
Go to participants and then hit the raise hand button on the bottom left.
On the bottom left. I don't see it.
So Nick has his hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Nick.
Thanks so much, Vernon. That was such an awesome presentation. I wanted to ask if you could kind of comment on, I guess one of the things that I'm always struck by when you talk about Crew is how community, I don't know, having community and being part of a community really does increase survival chances, and it's so devalued in our culture. I think in this very individualistic culture we live in. Could you comment on given the times that you've mentioned so much with COVID going around, how do we start to build community, and how do you think it's been sort of laid bare to show how little community we do have?
Well, I want to start by a quote by Desmond Tutu. He said, the bishop out of South Africa, he said, "My humanity is bound up in yours." And I also want to pull up a quote from another BU alum. You may have heard of him, Dr. Martin Luther King. What he said was that we're all tied into the inescapable garment of mutuality. What affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And he said, "I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And then when you become what you ought to be, then I can become what I ought to be." Then I want to go to the psychology field, to the Abraham Maslow hierarchy of needs. And hierarchy of needs. And he says, Maslow, for those who may not be familiar, he says that in order to be the best that you can be, he calls it self-actualization. You need these, he has a pyramid, and you need to reach these levels like basic needs, emotional needs, etc. But one of the needs that he pitched is community and people having community. And I really think this is the key to this whole thing, because COVID-19 has highlighted how much an individual in a community can affect others in the community. Watch this. Imagine someone being sick. We're told folks who have the COVID-19 ought to go and to self-isolate, right? Imagine someone has COVID-19 and they go and they walk in their community, or they go to a market. This one individual action can therefore cause a ripple effect and affect so many others in the community, positively and negatively. Obviously, for the COVID-19, it's negatively, but imagine in a positive manner that if folks are interested in connecting with their neighbors, and they have a sincere level of genuineness, and they have a sincere interest in connecting with people with no hidden agendas, I think a lot of people will be receptive to that. To being, especially when people are going through, various life circumstances and life situations. So I think COVID-19 raises this idea. And when we come out on the other side of this thing at some point, I think we're going to develop Crew is going to develop talking points around this idea of social resiliency and how much an individual in the community can be so impactful on what happens in that community. Obviously, we've heard, with COVID-19, we've heard of community spread, and we understand that the actions of one can cause complications for others, right? So, the thing that drew me to Crew and that protrudes out is we're strictly focused on building, having people build relationships, because it's clear extreme weather is going to happen at a greater duration and with greater intensity and with deeper impacts. Now, we must understand, and I share this all the time, that we know that the climate justice movement has historically predominantly been a white-led and white-involved movement. And people of color have been involved in other places. And that's real simple, because if one is struggling to put their food on the table, or if one is too tied up around racial justice issues and around economical justice issues, it's hard to focus on an invisible enemy, so to speak. Even though that the effects of climate change are present with us. Last July was the hottest day on record, the hottest July on record. In fact, I was in a WGBH article in November, and Crew has a relationship and a partnership with the Museum of Science, and I went around and we had this like measuring device of heat. Heat mapping project, and it's very fascinating. If you get a chance, if anyone's interested, you can Google that article, WGBH Heat Mapping Project, Museum of Science. So I just have a brief mention in the article, but we rode around and we were measuring like different hot spots. But so I think the point is that it's if we can come around, and another thing is, climate change can be a politicized term in this political charged environment that we live in. Crew, when I have my crew hat on, I have many different hats, but today I'm wearing a crew hat, but when I have a crew hat on, we stay nonpartisan because our goal is to engage Democrats, independents, and Republicans, people of faith, people of no faith, people of goodwill, people of moral conscience. In fact, I had the pleasure of telling Dr. Coco that we had Interfaith Summit last weekend, and about 100 people showed up. We were originally going to, and it's on our website. If you go to our website, climatecrew.org, and you can see, the agenda. The videos will be coming soon on the website. But I think people are thirsty and people are hungry for how can we build solidarity with each other, because I think we are more alike than we are different, right? DNA wise, if I remember correctly, I think human beings are 98% of the same DNA or the DNA structure. Don't quote me on that, but I think once we get this idea that our humanity is bound up with each other, like Bishop Desmond Tutu said, that my humanity is bound in your humanity, I think that we can break down these artificial walls of who's religious and who's not religious. All right, let me put a pin there. I see a hand. Are you on mute?
Yes. I have a couple of follow-up questions on that. So the first one is on the second point of the environmental movement is a white movement. So I was wondering the level of participation and who in general is participating in your community outreach when you work in low-income communities, for example. And also I wanted to hear your thoughts on how we can use social media to build social resiliency within a community.
All right, well, then that's great questions. Thank you for that. The first question, like the Interfaith Summit was very diverse. We were blessed to have a coalition of folks. We had a lot of coalition partners, and it was very diverse. It was We had our Native American brothers and sisters. We have and a large segment of other people of color that joined. We are intentionally striving. I come from a community of color, live in a community of color currently. We are intentionally striving, to build these crew teams in some of the most vulnerable communities. We have interest for people who live in Dorchester, which is in Boston, to start a crew team, and we were in the process of putting that together. And obviously, the corona's happened, so we were still in the process of building that. The other way that we involve people of color, and I didn't talk about this yet, is that we have intersectionality events. I had mentioned a little earlier that, it's hard, it historically has been hard for communities of color to get involved because there are other pertinent, relevant, in-your-face justice issues that people of color face that perhaps other folks don't face. So what we do and what we've done and what we have going on next week is we do intersectionality panels. So our first panel, we talked about the interconnection of climate, migration, housing, and peace issues. So for example, what we saw in Katrina is that what we saw in New Orleans is when Hurricane Katrina came and devastated the city, particularly the Ninth Ward, people lost houses, and their houses were destroyed. So they therefore became climate refugees. So we understand that hurricanes is related to the greenhouse gas, right? So when carbon's in the air produces greenhouse gas effect, and then the ices are melting in North Pole, South Pole, and therefore it causes these types of extreme weather events to happen, including hurricanes. So we understand that there's a correlation between climate change and extreme weather. Extreme weather and housing, for example, and therefore people have to become, they migrate. So what we try to do is we try to meet people where they are. We worked with the organization, which is in Roxbury. They were one of our panelists, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So we were blessed to have people from there. And what we try to do is we try to show this intersectionality component, because I think climate justice is a part of social justice. It's very much a part of social justice, but again, it's hard for people or communities of color to kind of see that when there's other pressing issues in the way and there's other roadblocks in the way. But I do believe that the climate crisis is the greatest existential threat to our human existence. And we do have an intersectionality. So our second intersectionality panel was around healthcare. That was the first one I mentioned. The second one was around healthcare, labor issues, climate change, and immigration, which we also, Sunrise was involved in, MIRA was involved in, Massachusetts refugee. I'm forgetting what MIRA stands for, but we can follow up later with that. Yeah, so, and then next week we're having a panel. We'll send the information to Coco. We have an intersectionality panel virtually between climate change and food security. And I saw there was a hand up.
We have a panelist here. Gabriele, go ahead. We can hear you. Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. Yes, I was saying I'm very much looking forward to being on the panel next week. And thank you for a wonderful talk, Reverend. I was curious, speaking of sort of intersectionality, I'm really curious about your insight on how to bring, I take it you must have to bridge sort of conversations of faith and climate change on occasion. And it seems, in my experience, that sometimes there's a discordance or disagreement between sort of overemphasis on protecting what is on earth when sort of perhaps some people feel a priority should be what's beyond this life, right? And so I'm curious about how to bring that conversation together without sort of making enemies or distancing people, how to like really bring community together around that.
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you in advance for being on the panel next week. We'll be there as an audience member. Looking forward to hearing the wonderful ideas that shall come forth because of that. So to answer your question, for me, there is a sacred obligation in a lot of our sacred texts to care for the earth. In the Christian tradition, there's a scripture that says, "The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof." There is, and I actually, I'm a part of, and I can send it to Coco to send it out. So last September, there was this like interfaith volume published, and I'm one of the authors in there. I'll share the URL link, and maybe perhaps Coco can share it. But the conversation for me centered around equity and justice. If we are talking through the lens, or talking about the equity and justice, then climate change is an equity and justice issue, because those who are disproportionately hurt by climate change are people of color. Those problems are the being hurt by climate change is exacerbated by all these other issues, such as urban heat island effects, such as lack of social resiliency, et cetera, such as lack of air conditioning, or a person doesn't want to turn on their AC in a community because their electric bill would be so high. So this is a justice, to me, this is the equity and justice issue. So I try to reframe the climate justice issue, or I try to reframe it in a sense, particularly with people of faith, is that this is a justice issue, equity and justice, and some members of the congregation are facing these equity and justice issues, or will be disproportionately hurt by by climate change. And I really go in it, starting about heat waves. You know, when I have conversation with religious leaders from various faith traditions, we really talk about, I really try, I'm very intentional about just talking about heat waves, you know, flooding, stormwater, and talking about, you know, these real tangible things, because no one can deny that there have been heat waves, that there is flooding, that there is more precipitation, it seems like. And then we can go and we can look at hurricane, for example. So I mentioned, and I know we got just a few seconds left. I mentioned a 1995 heat wave and 739 people died. But what I didn't tell y'all is that there was a heat wave in 2003 in Europe. 70,000 people died. So, you know, you can feel free to look that up. But it is interesting that it seems to be an undeniable reality, as so far as I've, you know, come across, where people cannot deny extreme weather. Now, people may not want to deal with it. People may not want to talk about it. People may not want to educate their members about it. And that's all fine, well, and dandy. But, you know, I have not faced any strong resistance or any argument that says, well, this is not real. When indeed, and in fact, even Ray Charles can see that we have these extreme impacts.
Great. Well, I think we should leave it here. So I just thought of an idea, because I have to meet with a few students who are taking this for credit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a breakout room for my students and myself, so we can go meet. And the rest of you are welcome to stay here if you have more questions for the Reverend, or you want to talk among each other. Feel free to use this space. But before I do that, I want to thank you one more time, Vernon. This was really interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
How do we clap?
Thank you. Thank you. I can hang around for another minute or two in case anyone has any questions or anything like that. And we will get those resources to Coco.
How are one of the questions that Coco asked you was about your use of social media to keep connectedness, and I'm kind of curious now because we are all zoomed up these days with COVID-19, and so in some ways I feel like the social media has been really important in this particular time, because I know some of the students, especially I've heard this among grad students, but this may be true among undergrads, they're feeling a lot of social isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And so are you finding really positive ways within your community to use the social media to increase social resilience to COVID-19?
Yes, thank you for reiterating that question. And I'm sorry, Coco, I didn't get to that question. I temporarily forgot about that question. Yeah, so we have a social media page. We have a social media coordinator. We have Instagram, we have Twitter. We have Facebook. So we are on these platforms and we engage our audience through these social media platforms. So we try to, we're actually thinking about, there's a candidate that's running for office, but he's an infectious disease doctor in District 8, Robbie Goldstein. I talked with him yesterday. And we're thinking about maybe engaging a conversation with him around like this COVID-19, nothing political. And then doing a late Facebook Live or, doing it that way. So that's how we've been, so we use, social media to not only promote our events, but to have robust conversations and try to answer people's questions. So we do use, and we want to stay connected to our following. So we do post. So we have our social media coordinator behind the scenes. We have her doing a lot of posting and things like that.
But you've learned a ton yourself in the last 2 weeks.
Oh yes. There's been a more increased need for these type of things, especially in the age of social distancing.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time. Kate, Rebecca, Carol, do you have any questions you want to pop in there quickly with, or if not, we can thank you again.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I was just listening into the last bits.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your time.
We
really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, and stay well, healthy, and I look forward to watching next week when Gabriela Garcia joins your organization and others to talk about these things.
Yes, and we'll make sure Coco puts that out in the newsletter because I'm going to get her to flyer today and for that event when Gabriela's joined us. And thank you so much, you all, for being here and engaging with us, and there's really thoughtful questions. And really do appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing hopefully some of you all at the event next week.
Okay, take care. Bye, Vernon.
All right, see you.